The order had already been signed. Rex, a decorated Belgian Malinois who had survived 4 combat deployments and saved 11 soldiers, was scheduled for termination in 72 hours. 3 handlers hospitalized, 2 formal incident reports, 1 unanimous recommendation from the K9 Evaluation Board. The military had made its decision, and nobody at Fort Well Army Medical Complex was going to argue with it. Nobody except a 31-year-old trauma nurse who had only been on base for 6 days, who had no clearance, no authority, and no business walking toward a dog that the entire K9 unit refused to enter the same room with. She walked straight toward his kennel, anyway. And the dog that had sent 3 trained soldiers to the emergency room sat down. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where we tell the stories nobody else dares to. Stories about ordinary people who turn out to be anything but. Stories that will shake you, surprise you, and stay with you long after they end. Hit the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment below. Tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The first thing anyone noticed about Nora Vasquez was that she was too calm. Not the practiced calm of someone who had learned to manage anxiety. Not the professional composure that nurses developed after years of trauma exposure. Something older than that. Something settled. She moved through the corridors of Fort Well Army Medical Complex in Dunmore, Virginia, with the kind of unhurried certainty that made people step out of her way without quite understanding why they'd done it. She had arrived on a Tuesday, transferred from a civilian hospital in Raleigh on what her paperwork described as a 12-week rotation to support the medical wing's understaffed trauma unit. Her credentials were clean. Her evaluations were excellent. She was 31 years old, 5'4", and she had a small scar running along the left side of her jaw that nobody asked about, and she never explained. The administrative staff liked her immediately. She was quiet, efficient, and she brought her own coffee thermos every morning instead of raiding the break room supply. The nursing supervisor, a broad-shouldered woman named Doris Langley, assigned her to the East Wing Trauma Unit and told her 3 things. Keep her badge visible at all times, do not enter any restricted corridors without an escort, and stay away from the K9 facility on the south side of the compound. "What's in the K9 facility?" Nora asked. Doris set down her clipboard. "A problem," she said. "That's what's in there, and it's not your problem." Nora nodded and didn't ask again. But that evening, after her first shift ended and she was walking back to the staff quarters across the base, she heard it. A low, sustained sound from somewhere beyond the chain-link barrier separating the medical compound from the training grounds. Not barking, not howling, something in between, the sound of an animal in a frequency of distress that most people would have registered only as noise. Nora stopped walking. She stood for a moment listening, then she kept going. But she came back the next morning, 20 minutes before her shift started, and stood at the fence. His name was Rex, and before the incident reports and the board evaluation and the termination order, he had been the most decorated active K9 in Fort Well's unit. A Belgian Malinois, 4 years old, with a dark muzzle and amber eyes and a chest that was disproportionately broad even for his breed. He had deployed to forward operating bases on 3 separate tours attached to a special operations team designated in his file only by a unit number. He had located IED placement twice, tracked 3 high-value individuals through rough terrain, and, in an incident that got 1 brief paragraph in a heavily redacted report, he had stood over the body of his handler for 4 hours in a compromised position until extraction arrived. His handler's name was Sergeant Marcus Tully. Marcus Tully had not come home. Rex had. The transition back to base had not gone well. It rarely did in cases like this, and the K9 unit coordinator, Major Stephen Okafor, had documented Rex's behavioral deterioration with the careful, reluctant handwriting of someone who did not want to be writing what he was writing. Increased reactivity, refusal to respond to new handlers. 3 separate incidents in which Rex had lunged and made contact. 1 handler with a broken wrist, 1 with lacerations across the forearm, 1 who had simply described the experience as the most frightening 30 seconds of his career. The evaluation board had convened 10 days ago. Their report was 4 pages long and their recommendation was 1 sentence. Rex was to be euthanized within 72 hours of the order's signing. Major Okafor had signed it at 0800 on Wednesday morning. His hand had been steady. His face, according to the specialist who witnessed it, had not been. Nora learned all of this from a 23-year-old specialist named Tommy Rios, who worked in the records annex and who had an unfortunate habit of telling people things they weren't supposed to know in exchange for someone listening to him talk. Tommy found Nora in the break room on her third day, noticed she was the only person in the room not looking at a phone screen, and sat down across from her. By the end of their lunch break, she knew about Rex. "They're doing it Friday," Tommy said, dropping his voice as though the walls were listening. "Doc Merriman is going to do it himself. Major Okafor requested that, at least. So it's not it's somebody Rex knows." "How long has he been in that kennel?" "Since the last incident, maybe 3 weeks. They bring him out for exercise, but 2 handlers have to be present, and they use, I don't know, it's a catch-pole setup. He goes crazy for loud commands, high-pitched sounds, sudden movements." "Does he eat?" Tommy blinked. "What? Does he eat regularly? Does he sleep? What's his body condition?" I mean, I assume he eats. I work in records. I don't... Who's his current contact handler? Someone has to be feeding him. Specialist Carver does the feeding, but he just slides the bowl in. He doesn't go in." Nora nodded slowly. She set down her coffee thermos. "Okay. You're not going to do something weird, are you?" Tommy said. She looked at him. "Probably not." Okay. She went to Major Okafor's office that same afternoon. This was, by most accounts, a mistake. Okafor was not an unkind man, but he was an efficient one, and he had the particular quality of military administrators who had learned to distinguish between legitimate concerns and time-wasting sentiment, and who had become perhaps too good at the distinction. He was 52 years old, with close-cropped gray at his temples, and reading glasses he was always taking on and off when he was irritated. He was taking them off when Nora finished speaking. "Let me understand this," he said. "You've been on this base for 4 days." "6, sir." "You've been on this base for 6 days, you work in the trauma unit, and you're here to talk to me about a K-9 case. I'd like access to Rex's behavioral file and his mission history, and I'd like permission to make a supervised observation visit to the kennel before Friday." Okafor put his glasses back on, looked at her, took them off again. "Vasquez, I've got 3 handlers who needed medical attention after interacting with that animal. I've got a board evaluation from people who have spent their careers in K-9 assessment. I've got an order that's already been signed. What exactly are you offering me?" "A second opinion," Nora said, "from a trauma nurse. From someone who's worked with traumatized patients for 7 years and who knows what acute stress response looks like when it's being mistaken for aggression." There was a pause. Okafor leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment in the way people do when they are deciding whether to be annoyed or intrigued. "Who told you about Rex?" "The base is small," Nora said carefully. He put his glasses back on and opened a folder on his desk. "The answer is no, Vasquez. The mission files are classified. The behavioral evaluation is an official record, and this is not your jurisdiction. Go back to your unit." Nora stood. "Thank you for your time, sir." She turned to leave. "Vasquez." She stopped. "How do you know the difference," Okafor said slowly, "between an animal that's dangerous and an animal that's afraid?" She turned back. "The dangerous one looks at you like a problem to solve," she said. "The afraid one looks at you like it's already lost." Okafor said nothing. She left. She was not deterred. This was the thing that nobody at Fortwell had yet understood about Nora Vasquez. She was not the kind of person who asked permission and then waited for it. She asked permission because it was the correct procedure, and when permission was denied, she simply found a different approach. The different approach, in this case, was Specialist Carver. Dale Carver was 25, homesick, and had been responsible for Rex's feeding for the past 3 weeks because every other specialist in the K-9 unit had found reasons to be unavailable. He was not afraid of the dog, exactly. He had described it to his bunkmates as like feeding a wolf who is also, somehow, disappointed in you specifically. But he was not comfortable, and he was very tired of doing it alone. Nora found him outside the kennel building at 06:30 on Thursday morning, carrying a food bucket and looking like a man walking to something he'd rather not walk to. "I'll come in with you," she said. He stared at her. "Ma'am, you can't. This is a restricted—" "I'm not going near the kennel. I'll stay by the door. I just want to observe." "Observe what?" "Him." Carver shifted the bucket. He looked at the building, then back at her, clearly calculating whether this would get him in trouble and deciding that a trauma nurse standing near the door was probably not technically a regulation violation. "Stay behind the yellow line," he said finally. "Don't make sudden moves. Don't raise your voice. And if he starts going for the gate, you back out immediately." "Understood." She followed him inside. The kennel building was longer than it looked from outside, with fluorescent lighting that hummed at a frequency Nora could feel in her back teeth. Rex was in the last kennel on the right, and she heard him before she saw him. That same low, sustained sound from the fence 2 nights ago. And underneath it, a quieter thing, almost a whimper, that cut off abruptly the moment footsteps approached. When she came into his sight line, Rex was already at the front of the kennel. He was bigger than she'd expected. The photographs in Tommy's unauthorized descriptions hadn't conveyed the actual mass of the animal, the depth of his chest, the extraordinary stillness he was capable of in the moment before movement. His eyes went to Carver first, tracking the food bucket with practiced wariness, and then they moved to her. He went very still. Carver slid the bowl in through the feeding slot, stepped back, and glanced at Nora to see if she needed to leave. She didn't move. She stood with her hands open at her sides, weight slightly forward, and she looked at Rex with the kind of attention that was not aggressive, the kind that said, "I see you," without demanding anything back. Rex looked at her for a long time. He did not eat. He did not make a sound. He just looked. "Okay," Carver said under his breath, because the silence was doing something strange to the air. "We should go." Nora took 1 step closer to the kennel gate, not close enough to reach, just closer. Rex did not lunge. His ears moved, his head dropped a fraction of an inch, and his eyes tracked her with an intensity that was not aggression and was not submission and was not anything that had a clean label. It was recognition, or something that wanted to become recognition, something that wasn't sure yet if it was safe to become that. "You've been alone for a long time," Nora said quietly. Not to Carver. To the dog. Rex's ears flicked forward. Carver grabbed her arm and pulled her back toward the door. "That's enough. Come on." She let him pull her. But she looked back once, and Rex was still watching the space where she'd been standing. The problem arrived the next morning in the form of Captain Adrian Hollis. Hollis was the base's chief medical officer, and she had the bearing of someone who had spent 20 years being the most competent person in every room she entered and had decided to simply make peace with that fact. She was 48, rigidly efficient, and she had received a report from Major Okafor's office, not about the kennel visit, which Carver had not reported, but about Nora's meeting with Okafor himself, which someone apparently had. She appeared in the trauma unit at 1000 on Friday morning, walked past 2 other nurses, and stopped directly in front of Nora's station. "Walk with me," she said. It was not a request. They walked to a consultation room off the main corridor. Hollis closed the door. "You went to Okafor," Hollis said. "Yes, ma'am." "About the K9?" "Yes." He said no. "He did." Hollis folded her arms. She had the look of someone doing rapid internal calculations. "Vasquez, I pulled your file this morning. Your rotation here was arranged through the Regional Medical Command in Raleigh. Your civilian trauma credentials are excellent, and your performance in the unit this week has been fine. I would like to keep it that way." She paused. "I'm telling you directly. Do not insert yourself into the K9 situation. The evaluation has been completed by qualified personnel. The order stands. Today is Friday, which means this is already over. Do you understand?" "I understand what you're telling me," Nora said. "That is not the same as saying yes." "No, ma'am, it isn't." Hollis looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted behind her eyes. A flicker of something that wasn't quite irritation. "Is there something in your background I should know about? Something that makes you think you have relevant expertise here?" Nora held her gaze. "I'm a trauma nurse." "That's all?" "That's what my current file says." The silence stretched. Hollis was clearly deciding whether to push. "Stay in your unit," she said finally. "If I hear you've been near that facility again, I will have your rotation ended and your transfer request filed by end of day. That's not a threat. That's administrative reality." She opened the door and left. Nora stood in the empty consultation room for a moment. She looked at the floor. Then she picked up her badge, clipped it back to her scrubs, and walked back out to her unit. She worked her shift. She was attentive and precise, and she did not, in any observable way, do anything she had been told not to do. At 15:45, 45 minutes before Rex was scheduled to be brought to the medical bay for the procedure, she was found standing outside the K9 facility again. This time, she had not tried to go inside. She was standing at the fence, and she was holding a small voice recorder. Specialist Carver found her there and went pale. "Vasquez, I told you, if they see you here, I need to play something for him," she said. "Through the fence, that's all. It'll take 30 seconds. "What? Why do you have a recorder? What's on that?" "A voice," she said. "One he used to know." Carver stared at her. "How did you get—" "The mission files are classified. There's no way you—" "I didn't access classified files," she said carefully. "Someone sent me something, from outside the base, someone who knew Rex's handler personally." She looked at Carver. 30 seconds, then I leave. Whatever happens after that is up to Okafor and Hollis. I need to try this one thing." Carver was a 25-year-old specialist who was homesick and tired and had been feeding a traumatized war dog alone for 3 weeks. And he looked at this small, calm, absolutely unmovable woman, and he made a decision that he would later describe to his bunkmates as either the bravest or the stupidest thing he'd ever done. 30 seconds, he said, "and then you are gone, and I was never here." They went inside. Rex heard them coming and was already at the front of the kennel. His eyes found Nora immediately. That stillness again. That suspended, waiting quality, like an intake of breath held too long. Nora raised the recorder. She pressed play. The voice that came out was male and young and worn thin at the edges in the way voices get when people are trying to hold something together that is breaking apart. The recording quality was poor, wind noise in the background, the distant mechanical sound of a helicopter, but the words were clear. "Guardian, rest, I've got you. Guardian, rest." The effect was instantaneous. Rex's body changed, not in the way it changed before he lunged, not the coiling, loaded transformation of an animal about to move. Something else. Something that went in the opposite direction. His head dropped. His ears folded back, not in aggression, but in the language of overwhelming recognition. A sound came out of him that Carver would later struggle to describe accurately. Not a whimper, not exactly, more like the sound an animal makes when something it had given up on suddenly returns. He sank to the floor of the kennel, and then, slowly, without any command, without any signal, he put his head down on his paws and closed his eyes. Carver's mouth was open. He was staring. "What?" he said softly. "Was that?" "That was Marcus Tully," Nora said. "Recorded 6 days before he was killed." She lowered the recorder. Rex wasn't attacking people. He was looking for someone who wasn't coming back. Every loud voice, every unfamiliar command, it was wrong. It wasn't him. Rex has been waiting for 3 months for a sound that makes sense, and nobody thought to give it to him. Carver looked at the dog lying still on the kennel floor. "He's going to be... They're coming in 45 minutes. "I know," Nora said. "I need to talk to Okafor. Right now. Will you come with me?" Carver swallowed. "This is going to end my career." "Or," she said, "it ends a death sentence for a soldier who came home from a war and nobody understood what he brought back with him." Carver looked at Rex for a long moment. The dog hadn't moved. He was lying on the floor of his kennel in a building full of fluorescent hum, and he looked, for the first time in 3 weeks, like something that was actually resting rather than waiting to survive whatever came next. "Okay," Carver said. His voice was unsteady. "Okay, let's go." They were halfway across the compound when the base emergency alert sounded. 3 sharp tones through the outdoor speakers, the kind that preceded an announcement, not an alarm. Nora stopped walking. The announcement came through. "Medical emergency, West Corridor, Building 7. All available medical personnel respond immediately." Building 7 was the administrative wing. The West Corridor was where Okafor's office was. Nora and Carver looked at each other. She started running. And Carver ran after her, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say. The alert was still cycling through the speakers, and the West Corridor of Building 7 was 400 meters across open ground, and Nora was already 20 feet ahead of him before he'd even processed that his legs were moving. She pushed through the main entrance doors without slowing down. The corridor inside was wrong immediately. 3 people standing in the middle of the hallway doing nothing, which was never a good sign, and the sound coming from around the corner was the particular controlled chaos of a medical situation where not enough people knew what they were doing. Nora turned the corner and found Major Okafor on the floor. He was conscious, which was something. He was sitting with his back against the wall outside his own office, one hand pressed to his chest, the other flat on the floor beside him, and his face had the gray, slightly stunned quality of a man whose body had just done something without asking permission. A young private was crouched beside him, trying to take his pulse at the wrist and doing it wrong. 2 other personnel were standing back, unsure whether to help or stay out of the way, which meant they were doing neither effectively. Nora crossed the distance in 4 strides, dropped to her knees, and moved the private's hand aside without ceremony. She found the pulse herself, rate elevated, rhythm irregular, not catastrophic, but not nothing, and she put her other hand on Okafor's arm. "Major, look at me." He looked at her. His eyes were present, which was good. "Vasquez," he said, and his voice was rough but coherent. "What are you doing in this building?" "Being the only medical person within 30 seconds of you, apparently." She was already running through it, the gray skin, the hand on the chest, the irregular rhythm. "Are you having chest pain right now? Pressure, tightness, anything radiating?" "It's not a heart attack." "That's not what I asked." He exhaled. "Pressure. Left side. Started maybe 10 minutes ago. I was standing up from my desk and..." He stopped. His jaw tightened briefly, the expression of a man who found physical vulnerability professionally embarrassing. "Okay, any history of cardiac events?" "No." "Arrhythmia? Family history?" "My father had a murmur." He paused. "I'm fine, Vasquez." "You're on the floor, sir." Behind her, Carver had arrived and stopped in the doorway, breathing hard. Nora turned her head just enough to speak to the nearest standing personnel, a female corporal who at least looked like she was tracking the situation. "Get me a crash cart from the East Wing, full kit. Tell them trauma nurse on scene, possible cardiac event. I need a monitor. Move now." She looked back at Okafor. "Has anyone called the base physician?" "Dr. Merriman he's at the K9 facility," the private said. "Right. Of course he was. Because the procedure was supposed to start in 40 minutes, and Merriman had been asked to be there early." Nora processed this fact and set it aside. "Get him on radio. Tell him he's needed here first." The private scrambled away. Okafor was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Not the irritation she'd expected, not the authority reflex she'd gotten from him yesterday. Something more careful than that. "You're not going to tell me to calm down," he said. "No. Most people tell me to calm down. It doesn't do anything useful for cardiac rhythm, and it wastes time." She checked his pulse again. Still elevated, still irregular. His color was marginally better than 60 seconds ago, which was a data point. "Can you tell me what was happening right before this? Stress level? Anything unusual?" Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I got a phone call 40 minutes ago." "Okay." "From a number I didn't recognize, a woman. She told me that Rex's mission files had been, that the evaluation board hadn't seen the complete behavioral history, that someone had pulled certain documents before the review." His voice was flat and careful, the voice of a man reporting a fact rather than processing one. "She told me there were recordings, field recordings from the final mission that would change the board's conclusions." Nora went very still. "Then the call ended," Okafor said, "and I stood up to go find Hollis, and apparently my heart had thoughts about that." The corporal returned with the crash cart, moving fast, and Nora pulled the monitor leads and began attaching them while she worked through what Okafor had just told her. The EKG trace appeared on the screen. She read it without touching the machine, running the rhythm pattern against her training, and let out a breath she'd been holding since she walked around the corner. Supraventricular tachycardia. Unpleasant, alarming, not immediately life-threatening if managed. His body had responded to acute stress with a cardiac event that looked worse than it was, which was both the good news and a problem, because it meant he'd been carrying this response for a while. "You're going to be okay," she said. "SVT, not a full cardiac event, but you need a physician and you need to not be on the floor." "I'm aware I'm on the floor, Vasquez." "We're going to get you up slowly, Carver." She looked up at the specialist still standing in the doorway, looking like he wished he were somewhere else. Come here and help me. They got Okafor upright and into his office chair, which someone had dragged out into the corridor because that seemed to have been someone's idea of help. By the time Dr. Merriman arrived, a compact, precise man in his 50s who was visibly wrong-footed by the call pulling him from the K9 facility, Nora had Okafor stable, documented, and with a preliminary assessment already verbalized for the handoff. Merriman looked at her. You're the trauma nurse from the East Wing. Vasquez. Yes. How long has he been symptomatic? 12 to 15 minutes when I arrived. Current trace shows SVT. Rate was at 142 when I first put the leads on. It's coming down. She handed him the monitor. Blood pressure was 160 over 104. He's coherent. Pain is reducing. No radiation to the arm or jaw. Merriman looked at the monitor, then at Okafor, then at Nora with the expression of a man recalibrating something. Good call, he said. Brief. But he meant it. He took over, and Nora stepped back, and Carver materialized beside her in the corridor and spoke very quietly into her ear. The procedure. It's supposed to start in 38 minutes. I know. Merriman's the one who's supposed to. I know. So does that mean? I don't know yet. She watched Merriman working, watched Okafor's color continue to improve incrementally, and she thought about phone calls from unrecognized numbers, and pulled documents, and a recording that a woman had described to a base commander 40 minutes before he ended up on the floor. Someone made that call to Okafor deliberately, she said quietly. Someone who knew about the files. Why would they call him instead of going through official channels? Because official channels here are the problem. She looked at Carver. Someone inside this base modified Rex's evaluation file before it went to the board, and whoever made that call knows who did it. Carver stared at her. How do you know the call wasn't just someone trying to cause trouble? Someone with an agenda? Because the specific detail about behavioral history documents getting pulled, that lines up with something I noticed independently. She kept her voice level. Rex's attack reports all reference the same response triggers. Loud verbal commands, handler proximity, sudden arm movements. But the standard trauma response protocol for canine animals with handler loss includes a mandatory observation period with sound familiarity testing. There's no record of that protocol being followed. None. It was either skipped or the record was removed. Carver was quiet for a moment. If someone on the evaluation board found out you're digging into this, they already know, she said. Why do you think Hollis came to my unit this morning? The corridor had quieted somewhat, personnel drifting back to their stations now that the immediate crisis was being handled. Merriman was talking to Okafor in low, direct tones. Nora watched them and thought about 38 minutes, which was now 36, and about the fact that Merriman was currently occupied and would remain occupied for at least the next 20 minutes, which meant that the schedule at the K9 facility had just developed a structural problem. Whether that was enough of a window was a different question. She looked at Carver. Go back to the kennel. Don't let anyone in until I get there. Vasquez, I can't just... Tell them Merriman got pulled for an emergency. Tell them you're waiting for confirmation on timing. Stall. She held his gaze. 10 minutes. That's all I need. Carver looked deeply unhappy. He also nodded and left. Nora turned back toward the office. She needed to talk to Okafor, and she needed to do it before Merriman decided he was stable enough to be moved to the medical wing, which would end the conversation before it started. She waited for a gap, Merriman stepping back to make a radio call, and moved forward. Major? She kept her voice quiet. Okafor looked up at her from the chair. He was still gray around the edges, but his eyes were sharp. He had the look of a man who had been scared and was now converting that fear back into control as efficiently as possible. The woman who called you, Nora said. Did she give you anything specific? A name, a document number, anything? Okafor studied her for a moment. She mentioned a specialist, said there was a specialist on the evaluation team who had flagged concerns about the file completeness and been told to drop it. He paused. She said the name was Reyes. Nora filed the name. Did she say who gave the order to drop it? She said it came from above the evaluation board. Okafor's voice was careful. Neutral in the way that careful people make things neutral when they are working hard not to show how not neutral they actually feel. She said if I looked at the sign-off dates on the behavioral reports, I'd see that 2 of them were backdated. Nora breathed in. Out. Who has the authority to backdate official K9 evaluation reports on this base? Okafor looked at her without speaking for a long moment. The answer was obvious, and they both knew it, and saying it out loud in a corridor with 3 other people within earshot was a different kind of step than just thinking it. Go do what you're going to do, he said finally. His voice was quiet. Whatever it is. I'm not asking. It was not permission. It was also not a refusal. Coming from a man like Okafor, in a moment like this, it was probably the most she was going to get. She left. The K9 facility was quiet when she got back. Carver was standing just inside the entrance with his arms folded and the expression of someone performing casual at a failing grade. Across the room, Specialist Carver had apparently told 2 other personnel something convincing enough that they were milling near the far door without coming any closer. Rex was still lying on the kennel floor in the same position she'd left him, head on his paws, eyes open. He tracked her the moment she came into his sight line. She pulled a folding chair from against the wall. There was always a chair near kennels, in her experience, for the people who spent too many hours there, and she sat down 4 feet from the kennel gate and didn't say anything. She didn't play the recording again. She just sat there. Rex watched her. There was a sound from outside, Mum. A door, voices, something on the edge of her attention, and she registered it without turning around. Her focus stayed on the dog. He was watching her with that suspended quality she'd noticed before, that quality of a thing calibrating whether or not the moment in front of it was real. She'd seen it in humans. She'd seen it in the year she spent working evacuation support before she transitioned to civilian trauma care, in the faces of people who had been in situations where reality had stopped being reliable and hadn't fully decided whether the current moment was trustworthy yet. It was a very specific look. Most people who hadn't been in those situations couldn't identify it because they'd never needed to. She could identify it in her sleep. Nobody told you what happened, she said quietly. That's the thing, isn't it? He just didn't come back. And then there were strangers, and noise, and commands in the wrong voice. And nothing explained any of it. Rex's ears moved. Not toward her exactly, more like he was listening past her. He's not coming, she said. She kept her voice even, not soft in a way that would be condescending, just level, honest. I know that doesn't fix anything, but he's not coming, and you've been holding on to a door that's been closed for 3 months, and at some point that has to change. It doesn't mean forgetting, it just means... She stopped. Thought. It means you're still here, and that means something, even if it doesn't feel like it right now. Rex put his chin down on his paws. It was a small thing, a dog setting his head down. But Carver, watching from across the room, let out a breath that had apparently been stuck in his chest for a while. The door behind them opened. Nora turned. It was not Merriman. It was Captain Adrian Hollis, and she was not alone. There was a man with her that Nora didn't recognize, in his mid-50s, in a uniform that put him at a rank above Hollis, with the particular bearing of someone who managed things from considerable altitude and was not accustomed to showing up in kennel buildings. Hollis looked at Nora. The look was not surprise. It was something colder than surprise. I told you this morning, she said. I made myself very clear. Yes, ma'am. And you're standing in this facility anyway. Yes, ma'am. The man with Hollis, a colonel, Nora was reading the insignia now, was looking around the kennel building with the expression of someone assessing a situation rather than reacting to it. His eyes moved to Rex, then to Nora, then back to Rex, who had not moved. Who is this? He said to Hollis. A civilian trauma nurse on rotation, Hollis said. She was told twice to stay away from this animal. Vasquez, the colonel said, reading her badge. Why isn't the dog reacting to you? It was a direct question, and it came from a rank that deserved a direct answer. Because I'm not giving him any reason to, she said. The evaluation report suggests that his reactivity threshold is... The evaluation report is incomplete, she said. Sir? Hollis went very still. The colonel's expression didn't change, which was more interesting than if it had. That's a significant claim, he said. I'm aware. I can support it. She kept her voice level. She had learned in other contexts that the worst thing you could do when making an uncomfortable claim to someone who had authority over your situation was to soften it. Softening it gave people room to dismiss it as uncertainty. Rex's behavioral evaluation did not include mandatory sound familiarity protocols for handler loss cases. The records of those protocols either were never created or have been removed from his file. Two of the existing behavioral reports have sign-off dates that don't align with the incident dates they document. She paused. And Major Okafor received a phone call approximately an hour ago from an outside source who told him that a specialist on the evaluation team raised concerns about the file's completeness and was ordered to drop them. Silence. Carver was very still near the wall. Hollis's face had undergone a shift that was small and controlled and gave away more than she probably intended. The colonel was looking at Nora with the full weight of his attention in a way that was either very good or very bad. Major Okafor is currently in medical observation, the colonel said slowly, which is why I'm here. I was notified of his cardiac event. He looked at Hollis. Is there a specialist named Reyes on the evaluation team? Hollis's response was one beat too slow. There was a specialist Reyes who participated in the initial observation phase. He was reassigned before the final report. Reassigned, the colonel said. When? I'd have to check the exact date. Check it. He looked back at Nora. You said you can support the claim about the evaluation report. I can walk you through the discrepancies. Yes, sir. He nodded once. Then he looked at Rex, still lying on the kennel floor, still watching Nora with those amber eyes, and something moved across his face that was not quite readable, but was not nothing. What does the dog need right now? He asked. Nora blinked. She hadn't expected that question from him. Time, she said, and someone to stop treating him like a problem to be processed. The colonel was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to Hollis. Hold the procedure. Colonel, the evaluation board, hold it, pending review. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. And get me the contact information for Specialist Reyes. Hollis stood with her jaw set in the careful way of a senior officer managing a response she didn't want anyone to see. Yes, sir, she said. He walked out. She followed him. Nora stood in the kennel building and listened to their footsteps fade, and then she sat back down in the folding chair because her legs were doing something unsteady that she preferred not to have anyone notice. Carver was staring at her from across the room with his mouth slightly open. Who was that? He managed. Colonel. I didn't catch the name. That was Colonel Darius Webb, Carver said slowly. He's the base commander. Nora processed that. He's Hollis's commanding officer, Carver continued. He's Okafor's commanding officer. He's basically, when he tells you to hold something, it stays held until he personally unsays it. Rex made a sound. Low, brief, more breath than vocalization. He had shifted slightly on the kennel floor, rolling from his chest to his side, and his eyes were still on Nora, but the expression in them had changed in some way that was hard to quantify. Less suspended, less like a thing waiting for a verdict. She knows you, Carver said quietly. He wasn't talking about Hollis. No, Nora said. He doesn't know me. He just... She stopped. He knows I'm not pretending to be something I'm not. That's different. She stayed in the chair. Rex stayed on the floor. Outside, the base moved around them, the alert cycle ending, normal operations resuming, the ordinary machinery of the day reassembling itself around the extraordinary thing that had just happened in a kennel building in the South Compound. What Nora did not say, and what Carver did not ask, was the thing that had been sitting underneath all of it since she'd played the recording that morning. The voice in the recording. The specific phrasing of the command, Guardian. Rest. Those were not standard K9 commands. They were unit-specific, developed in the field, the kind of shorthand that built up between a handler and an animal over months of proximity. The fact that Rex had responded to them was not surprising. What was surprising, what was the thing she was turning over and over in the back of her mind while she sat in the folding chair and watched a traumatized Belgian Malinois breathe, was how she had known to find that recording, how she had known what to look for, and where, and who to contact. Because the person who had sent her the recording wasn't a stranger. The recording had arrived in her personal email at 0500 this morning, from an address she didn't recognize, with a message that said only, "You know what this is for. You always knew what to do with broken things." She had not responded to the message. She did not know who had sent it, but she knew the voice on the recording, not Marcus Tully's voice, which she had never heard before, but the background sound, The specific acoustic signature of the location it was recorded in, the helicopter model audible in the ambient noise. She knew that sound because she had heard it before, in a different context, in a different country, in a different version of her life. She had not told Carver this. She had not told Okafor. She had not told the colonel. She was going to have to tell someone. She just needed to figure out who that someone could actually be trusted to be. And she needed to do it before whoever had tried to bury Rex's file figured out that the colonel was now asking questions and decided it was time to bury something else. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. Unknown number. She stared at it for 1 ring, 2 rings, and then she picked up and said nothing. There was a pause on the other end. Then a woman's voice said, "You found him." Nora stood up slowly from the chair. "Who is this?" "Someone who's been watching this base for 4 months, the woman said. "Someone who knows exactly which documents got pulled and who signed the order. And someone who is about to need you to make a decision very quickly because the person who buried Rex's file just found out the colonel is involved, and they're not the kind of person who waits around to see how things develop." Nora was already moving toward the kennel door. "What does that mean?" "It means they have a way to make this go away before it becomes an official inquiry." The voice was even and measured, the voice of someone delivering intelligence, not emotion. "And it means whatever evidence you have, whatever you've documented, whatever discrepancies you can show, you need it in front of Colonel Webb in the next hour, because after that, things get considerably more complicated." "Tell me who you are," Nora said. "I'll tell you that when you're safe," the woman said. "Right now I need you to move." The call ended. Nora lowered the phone. She looked back at Rex, still lying on the kennel floor, watching her with amber eyes that held something that had not been there 3 hours ago. Something that was not quite trust yet, but was the shape of a thing that might become it, given the chance. Carver was staring at her. "What just happened?" She slid the phone into her pocket. "I need everything," she said. "Every record you can access, every date discrepancy in Rex's file, every piece of paper that connects the evaluation timeline to whoever approved the final report." She held his gaze. "We have an hour." Carver blinked. He looked at Rex. He looked at the door the colonel had walked out of. He looked at Nora, who was already calculating something behind her eyes that he couldn't follow, but that had the quality of a person not running through options so much as running through a plan that already existed. "You've done this before," he said slowly. It wasn't quite a question. She didn't answer it. "Records office. Now." They were 3 steps from the door when it opened from the outside, and the person who walked through was not the colonel, and was not Merriman, and was not anyone Nora had seen on the base in 6 days. It was a woman in civilian clothes, mid-40s, with close-cropped hair and the particular way of holding herself that Nora recognized from a category of people she had worked alongside in a different life. The kind of stillness that came from training, not temperament. The woman looked at Nora, not at Carver, not at Rex, not at the room. Directly at Nora, with the recognition of someone who had known exactly who they were looking for. "Vasquez," she said. Nora's voice was very level. "Who are you?" "My name is Lena Marsh," the woman said, "and we don't have time for the version of this where you ask questions first." She stepped forward and held out a drive, a small encrypted USB drive of the type that had a very specific pedigree, the kind that was issued in contexts Nora was not supposed to know about. "Everything is on here. The original mission files, the original behavioral assessments, the communication chain that shows who ordered what removed and when." She paused. "And the name of the person on this base who's been covering it up for 3 months." Nora took the drive. She held it in her palm and looked at it, and she understood in that moment that the next step was not reversible. That taking this to Webb meant opening something that was going to go well past a K-9 evaluation discrepancy, past a backdated report, past a single corrupt administrator. It was going to pull a thread that was attached to other threads, and some of those threads were going to be attached to people with considerably more resources than a 45-minute termination window. Rex made a sound from the kennel. That same low breath. She looked at him. He was watching her, waiting. She closed her hand around the drive. "Let's go," she said. They moved fast and they didn't talk about it. Lena Marsh walked point, which told Nora something about her training without requiring any explanation. She moved through the base corridors the way people moved when they had already mapped every exit, every camera position, every place where a conversation could be overheard. Not quickly enough to draw attention, not slowly enough to be intercepted. Carver fell in behind Nora and did a reasonable job of looking like someone going somewhere routine, which was probably the best that could be asked of him under the circumstances. Nora turned the drive over in her hand as they walked. It was warm from Lena's pocket. She kept thinking about the communication chain Lena had mentioned, the chain that showed who had ordered documents removed. She had a candidate in mind. She had been building the candidate in the back of her head since Okafor had gone carefully neutral in his office chair and not said the name of the person with authority to backdate official evaluations. Some things were loud because of the sound they made. Others were loud because of the specific shape of the silence around them. The records annex was in the east building, which meant crossing the open ground between the south compound and the main complex. 40 seconds of exposure in the middle of a base that was, as of approximately 15 minutes ago, operating with at least one person in a senior position who had realized that the colonel was asking questions they had spent 3 months preventing anyone from asking. Lena stopped them at the corner before the open ground. She looked both ways with the particular unhurried efficiency of a person doing something that looked like nothing. "The security office pulls camera feeds on a 4-hour cycle," she said, low and direct. "We're clean for another 22 minutes. After that, anyone checking the archives for personnel movement is going to see us in the East Wing." "What happens in 22 minutes?" Carver asked. "A request goes in for a full security review of base movement logs," Lena said. "Triggered automatically when a command-level officer initiates an inquiry. Webb signed the inquiry paperwork 8 minutes ago." She looked at Nora. "That's how they'll know where we are. Not from someone watching a monitor, from a system flag." "Who gets notified when the flag goes up?" "The base security office, and the officer who has administrative override access to the security system." Carver made a sound. "Who has administrative override?" Lena looked at him without answering, which was its own answer. "Hollis," Nora said. Lena nodded once. They crossed the open ground. Nora kept her pace even, her eyes forward, her badge visible. The morning had gone cold in the way Virginia mornings sometimes did in late October, that particular coldness that got into the joints rather than the skin. She was aware of everything around her with the kind of peripheral acuity that came back to her sometimes without warning. The sound of a door somewhere behind them, a vehicle moving in the lower lot, a camera housing on the east building's corner that was angled 4 degrees too far to the left to catch the secondary entrance. She had noticed the camera angle on day 2. She hadn't known why she was noticing it then. She did now. They went in through the secondary entrance. The records annex was staffed by 2 people at this hour, neither of whom was Tommy Rios, which was both a relief and a complication. The specialist at the front terminal looked up when they came in, registered Lena's civilian clothes and Carver's uniform and Nora's scrubs and badge, and performed the rapid internal calculation of someone deciding whether this was a problem that fell inside or outside their designated concern. Carver spoke first, which was smart. He had a face that inspired a particular kind of uncritical trust in administrative personnel. "I need to pull K9 unit evaluation records for a command-level review. Case Ref 774 Delta. Colonel Webb's office requested it." The specialist looked at the terminal, typed something, looked at it again. "I'm seeing a hold on 774 Delta. Processing restriction pending security flag." The flag was already up. They were 15 minutes early by Lena's calculation, which meant either the calculation had been off or someone had moved faster than expected. Lena stepped forward. "Who placed the hold?" "Administrative override. I don't have visibility into the authorization chain on that." "Can you tell me when it was placed?" 11 minutes ago." 11 minutes ago was before Webb had signed the inquiry paperwork, before the automatic system flag. 11 minutes ago was roughly the same time that Hollis and Webb had walked out of the kennel building. Nora did the math in the time it took, had placed the hold before any formal inquiry existed to trigger the protocol. That was not the action of someone responding to a process. That was the action of someone who knew the process was coming and had moved to cut it off at the source, which meant Hollis had not just been covering for someone else. Hollis knew exactly what was in those files. "I need to speak to Colonel Webb directly," Nora said to the specialist. "Ma'am, I can't. This is not a request for records access," she said. "I need you to contact his office and tell him that the administrative hold on 774 Delta was placed before his inquiry was formally initiated. He'll understand why that matters." She held the specialist's gaze. Do that now, please. Not in 10 minutes. Now. The specialist looked at her, looked at the terminal, looked at Carver, who gave a small, decisive nod that managed to convey command authority significantly above his actual rank. The specialist picked up the phone. Lena moved close to Nora. "We're out of time," she said quietly. "Whatever's on that drive needs to be in Webb's hands, not in a record system that Hollis can touch. Physical transfer only. Where's Webb right now?" "Main administration, second floor. He went back after the kennel." She paused. "There's a problem." "What?" "Hollis's office is also on the second floor." Nora absorbed this. "Can we get to Webb without going through that corridor?" "There's a stairwell access off the east atrium. It comes out 20 meters from his office. But someone would need to be at the bottom of that stairwell to stop anyone coming up behind us, and I can't be in two places." Carver raised his hand slightly. It was such an unmilitary gesture, so instinctively junior, that Nora almost would have smiled in different circumstances. "I'll be at the bottom of the stairwell," he said. "You understand what that means," Lena said. It was not a question. "I understand that someone needs to do it, and I'm the one who's here." He looked steadier than he had any right to look, for a 25-year-old homesick specialist who had started his morning planning to slide a food bowl through a kennel slot and go to breakfast. "Go." The east atrium smelled of floor wax and recycled air. The stairwell door was heavy, the kind that sealed properly and made a sound when it opened. They went up fast. Second floor landing, 20 meters of corridor. Webb's office door was open. He was standing at his window when they came in, looking at something outside. Not looking at nothing, actually looking, the posture of a man who had been standing there turning over something uncomfortable. He turned when he heard them. His eyes went to Lena first, with the recognition of someone who had encountered her type before and was not surprised to encounter it again. Then to the drive in Nora's hand. "Close the door," he said. She did. He sat down. She put the drive on his desk. He looked at it without touching it. "You want to tell me what's on this before I plug it in?" "The original behavioral assessment reports for Rex," Nora said. "The complete versions, including the observation period protocols that should have been in the evaluation file and weren't. The mission recording from Sergeant Tully's final deployment, the complete version, not the excerpt in the redacted record. And the communication chain between this base's administrative office and the evaluation board coordinator, documenting the instruction to remove specific materials from the case file before board review." Webb was quiet for a moment. "Who does the communication chain name?" "Hollis," Lena said. "Captain Adrian Hollis. The instruction to pull the behavioral history documents came from her office on the 14th. The evaluation board convened on the 16th. The board never saw the complete file." Webb's expression did not change in the dramatic way of someone receiving a shock. It changed in the smaller, worse way of someone who had been building toward a conclusion they did not want to reach and had just arrived at it. "What's her motive, he said. Not arguing, processing. "Sergeant Tully's final mission," Lena said. "The extraction that went wrong. The investigation into that mission was closed without a formal findings report, because key behavioral evidence, specifically Rex's field logs from the operation, was considered too volatile for inclusion in the official record. Someone made that determination. Hollis was the administrative liaison for mission documentation at the time. She buried the mission report," Webb said. "She didn't bury it, she shaped it. The report exists. It just doesn't say what actually happened." Lena's voice was even and unperturbed. The voice of someone accustomed to delivering information that made people's professional lives significantly more complicated. "Rex's behavioral record is connected to that mission because anyone who looked at the complete timeline, the mission date, the trauma onset, the specific triggers, would have questions about what he witnessed, about what happened to Tully and why the extraction failed. And those questions would lead back to decisions Hollis made or signed off on." "Yes." Webb sat with this. Outside, somewhere on the base, a door opened and closed, and footsteps moved through the corridor below them. Ordinary footsteps, nothing urgent. And the base continued turning around them without knowing that something was cracking open in a second-floor office. "I need to verify this independently," Webb said finally. I'm not dismissing this, but I need source verification before I can take any administrative action against a captain." "You have the drive," Nora said. I have a drive from an unverified civilian source that was handed to me by a nurse on rotation. His voice was not unkind, it was accurate. That's not verification. That's the start of a conversation. Then start it fast, Lena said, because the hold Hollis placed on Rex's records 11 minutes ago was preemptive. She didn't wait for your inquiry to flag the system. She had administrative override ready before you signed the paperwork. Webb looked up. That landed. She could see it land. Not the information itself, but the implication of timing, the specific shape of what preemptive action said about what someone already knew and had already planned. His jaw shifted slightly. She knew I was going to initiate, he said. She knew the moment you walked out of that kennel building, Nora said. He pulled the drive toward him. He looked at it for 2 full seconds. Then he plugged it into the secure terminal on his desk, and whatever was on it began to load, and his face did the thing that faces do when written evidence confirms a thing you have been trying to decide whether to believe. It went very still and very serious and slightly older. The corridor outside the office went quiet, and then it went wrong. The sound was not dramatic. It was a door and a voice and footsteps with a specific weight and pace that Nora recognized before she consciously processed why, because her body remembered that walk from 3 separate encounters in the past 6 days. Hollis. In the corridor outside, moving with the absolute unhurried authority of someone who was not planning to knock. Webb was already standing. His hand went to his desk phone. He got one word out, security, before the door opened. Hollis stepped in. She looked at the drive in Webb's terminal. She looked at Lena Marsh. She looked at Nora. The journey across those 3 objects took approximately 2 seconds, and what Nora saw in Hollis's face during those 2 seconds was not the expression of a person caught. It was the expression of a person who had walked in knowing exactly what they were walking into and had made a calculation about what to do anyway. "Colonel," she said. Her voice was level, controlled. The voice of someone who had 20 years of experience managing crisis from a position of authority and who had not, up to this moment, lost that position. "This situation has been significantly misrepresented to you." "Adrian." Webb's voice was careful. "The civilian who provided that drive," she indicated Lena without looking at her, "is not a verified source. She has a documented history of unauthorized access to restricted military records. Anything on that drive should be treated as potentially compromised intelligence." "That's an interesting claim," Lena said. "Do you want to tell the colonel what you know about my history and how you know it?" "A beat, small but real." "The record's hold was a precautionary measure," Hollis continued, shifting slightly. "Standard protocol when sensitive case files become the subject of informal inquiries by unauthorized personnel. The K-9 evaluation was conducted by a certified board. The findings were..." "Captain." Webb's voice had changed, not louder, just different in a way that closed certain doors. "The hold was placed before the inquiry existed. Walk me through that." Hollis's composure was extraordinary. Nora would have acknowledged that in any other context. She didn't flinch, didn't over-explain, didn't retreat into defensiveness. She stood there with the bearing of a 20-year officer and said, "I anticipated that informal concerns being raised by unvetted personnel might create administrative complications. I acted proactively." "You acted before I had signed a single document," Webb said. "There was nothing to anticipate. There was nothing official. How did you know?" The silence lasted 3 seconds. In 3 seconds, Nora counted 5 separate things: the sound of Webb's terminal processing data, the hum of ventilation, a vehicle outside, Hollis breathing, and her own heartbeat doing something it had not done in a long time. The specific elevated rhythm of a moment that was about to break one way or the other with no middle ground available. Hollis looked at Nora. It was a direct look. Not angry, something more considered than angry, and in some ways more unsettling. "You have no idea what you've walked into," she said. "Tell me," Nora said. The mission that killed Sergeant Tully was not a standard extraction failure. The intelligence that sent his team into that position came from a source that is still active, still operational. If the full mission report surfaces, if Rex's field logs get attached to an official inquiry, the source gets exposed, and the source has people in places that can make a very significant amount of damage happen. She paused. "I didn't bury that report to protect myself. I buried it to protect an ongoing operation." The room was very quiet. Webb was watching Hollis with an expression that had become unreadable, which was its own kind of reading. If that were true, he said slowly, you would have come to me. In 3 months, you would have found a way to tell me there was a sensitivity issue. I couldn't tell you without exposing the connection. Adrienne, his voice was not angry. It was something worse, in the way that disappointment from a specific kind of person is worse than anger. I've known you for 11 years. Something moved across Hollis's face. Not breaking. The wall held, but a crack ran through it, visible for 1 second before she closed it. I made a decision with the information I had. Rex was a liability. The evaluation gave me a clean procedural path to eliminate the one piece of evidence that could draw questions, Lena said. Not a liability to an ongoing operation, a liability to your management of a specific failure that happened on your watch. She let that sit for a moment. The source you're describing, it doesn't exist. I've been tracking the mission documentation for 4 months. There is no active operation connected to that intelligence chain. There was one. It was closed 8 weeks ago. Whatever the source was protecting, it stopped mattering 2 months ago. You've been running a cover for a ghost. Hollis turned on Lena fully now. You don't have clearance for... I have exactly the clearance I need, Lena said, and it comes from considerably higher than this base command structure. The weight in the room shifted. Nora felt it shift. It was a physical thing, the redistribution of who was standing where in relation to where the authority actually lived. And watching Hollis register it was one of the most precise and uncomfortable things she had witnessed in a room full of people all trying to hold something together. Webb looked at his terminal. He was reading something. His face did not move, but his hand on the desk tightened very slightly. The backdated reports, he said quietly. They were signed under my predecessor's authorization code. He looked up, which has been inactive for 4 months. The code was used to access the system, Lena said, from a terminal with a physical location. That location is in the administrative wing. Webb stood up from his chair. He was not a dramatic man. He did not raise his voice or make any gesture toward the phone or say anything that would later have to be repeated in an account of the moment. He simply stood, and the standing was enough to change the entire geometry of the room. Captain Hollis, he said, you're going to come with me. Hollis stood very still. Not... She stopped. Started again. Colonel, if this becomes a formal inquiry, certain individuals are going to become aware of it. I am telling you that the downstream consequences of an investigation reaching, the downstream consequences of not investigating are sitting on my screen right now, Webb said. A dog that spent 3 months in a kennel waiting to be killed for reacting to trauma that nobody acknowledged because it was more convenient to disappear him than to answer questions about how his handler died. He stepped from behind the desk. I'm aware of how these things work, Adrienne. I'm aware of who gets uncomfortable when inquiry processes start. I've been aware of that for 20 years. It has never been a sufficient reason to execute a military working dog rather than read a file. He looked at her without anger or theater, just with the settled weight of someone who has been deciding something for a long time and has finally decided. Come with me. Hollis looked at Nora one more time. The look was not a threat. It was something more exhausted than that, and more complicated. It was the look of a person seeing clearly, for the first time in some months, the distance between the thing they had done and the thing they had told themselves they were doing. Then she straightened, and she walked ahead of Webb into the corridor, and the door closed behind them both. Nora stood in the empty office. Lena moved to the terminal and pulled the drive. He'll need this for the formal chain of custody, she said. I'll hold it until the JAG office opens a case file. What just happened? Nora said. She wasn't asking Lena exactly. She was asking the room, or herself, or the particular aftermath quality of air that accumulated in spaces where something large had just collapsed. The beginning, Lena said. The formal part starts now. Investigation, review board, evaluation reinstatement. It's going to take time. She pocketed the drive. Rex isn't being terminated today. No, Nora said. He isn't. She sat down in Webb's empty chair. Not because she was entitled to sit in it, but because her legs had finally decided that the adrenaline bill from the last 3 hours was due, and it was due right now. She put her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands for 10 seconds, which was all she was going to allow herself, and she breathed in and breathed out and noted the specific shaking in her hands with the detached professional interest of someone taking inventory. You need to eat something, Lena said. She was not looking at Nora. She was looking at the window. I need to go check on Rex. You need to eat something first. Your hands are shaking. They do that. It passes. Lena turned from the window. She looked at Nora with an expression that had dropped the operational evenness for a moment. Not gone soft, nothing like that, just briefly without the professional surface layer. You did well, she said. I haven't done anything yet, Nora said. This is the part where it gets official and bureaucratic, and the people who actually get to make decisions take over. I'm a trauma nurse on a 12-week rotation. I'm not... You got the recording to Rex, Lena said. You made the argument in a room where nobody was going to listen to it. You walked into a kennel where a dog had sent 3 people to medical, and you sat down in a folding chair. She paused. Sometimes the thing that looks small is not the small thing. Nora looked at her hands. They were still shaking slightly. She closed them into loose fists, let them open again. Who are you? She said. Not your name. I know your name. Who are you to this? Lena was quiet for a moment. I served with Marcus Tully, she said. Not on his last deployment, before. She looked back at the window. When the mission report came back wrong, I started pulling threads. It took 4 months. Followed it here. She paused. I needed someone already inside. Someone with medical access. Someone Rex might respond to. Someone who knew how to read an animal that was trying to tell you something it didn't have language for. She looked at Nora. Your name came up. From who? From someone who spent 7 years watching you work. Nora sat with that. She thought about the email at 0500. You always knew what to do with broken things. You could have told me, she said. At the beginning, you could have told me what this was actually about. Would you have walked into the kennel differently? She thought about it honestly. No. Then it didn't matter. Lena moved toward the door. Eat something, then go back to the kennel. He's going to need you there when the formal review team shows up, because they're going to want to conduct an assessment, and Rex is going to need a familiar presence. She stopped with her hand on the door. Familiar. You've known him for approximately 6 hours. I know, Nora said. That's enough. Lena nodded. She left. Nora sat in Webb's chair for another 30 seconds. She looked at the window, at the gray Virginia sky outside, at the base going about its ordinary business below. Vehicles, personnel, the flag at half-staff for something she didn't know about. The ordinary infrastructure of a place where extraordinary things happened regularly and people built lives around pretending otherwise. Her phone buzzed. Carver, from the stairwell. All quiet here. What happened? She typed back. Come up. It's over. A pause. Then, Rex? She typed. He's okay. Another pause, longer. Then, thank God. She almost corrected him. She didn't. She stood up, put the phone away, and straightened her scrubs. She was hungry. Lena was right about that. She was also aware that the formal process was beginning and that it was going to be long and institutional and resistant to the kind of direct pressure that had worked in the last 3 hours, and that she was going to need patience for it that she was not entirely sure she had in supply. Patience had never been her strongest quality. She was better at the part where you just walked into the room and did the thing. She went to the door. The corridor outside was empty. One direction led to the stairwell, to Carver, to the exit route that would take her to the cafeteria and then back to the kennel. The other direction led further into the administrative wing, toward Hollis's office, past the point where Webb and Hollis had turned a corner and disappeared. She went toward the cafeteria. She was halfway down the stairs when her phone rang again. Unknown number. Different unknown number than the one from before. She stopped on the landing and answered. The voice was male, clipped, unhurried in the way that voices were when they were used to making calls that mattered. Vasquez, it said. This is Deputy Inspector Marcus Pryor, Army Criminal Investigation Division. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to let that land. We've been monitoring activity on Fort Well's administrative systems for approximately 6 weeks as part of an existing investigation. Your activity in the past 4 hours has intersected with that investigation in a way I need to speak with you about. Another pause. We know about Hollis. We knew before today. What we did not know, what we are now very interested in, is how a trauma nurse on a 12-week rotation accessed an encrypted drive containing materials from a classified mission file, who provided that drive, and what other parties have been involved in today's events. The voice was even and professional, with the specific quality of law enforcement patience, the kind that was not hostile, just inexorable. Ms. Vasquez, we're going to need to talk about Lena Marsh. Nora stood on the stairwell landing. Below her, she could hear Carver moving up the stairs. Above her, the second-floor door was closed and still. The drive was gone. Lena was gone. And the investigation that Nora had thought was over had just revealed itself to be something considerably larger, with a floor she hadn't found yet, and an origin she had been standing too close to see clearly. I understand, she said carefully. Good, Pryor said. Don't leave the base. She hung up and stood on the landing for a moment with the phone in her hand and the particular stillness of someone recalibrating every assumption they had made in the past 6 hours. Carver appeared at the bottom of the stairwell, looking up at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting in a concrete stairwell for 20 minutes and had developed strong opinions about it. He read her face immediately. What happened? Army CID, she said. They've been watching the base for 6 weeks. He stared at her. Watching for what? They didn't specify. She came down the remaining steps. They want to talk to me about Lena Marsh. Carver processed this. She watched him work through it, the drive, Marsh's operational bearing, the specificity of the information she had carried, the way she had moved through the base with the knowledge of someone who had been here before in some form, mapping it from the outside. She wasn't just a source, he said. No, Nora said. She wasn't. They stood in the stairwell. Above them, through the door and down the corridor, whatever was happening between Webb and Hollis was happening without them. Institutional machinery engaging with a grinding slowness that was the opposite of everything that had moved fast in the past 3 hours. Below them, the base, the kennel. Rex. Go back to the kennel, she said to Carver. Stay with him until someone from the review team shows up. Don't let anyone in who isn't carrying Webb's direct authorization. Where are you going? To find Pryor before he finds me. She moved past him toward the ground floor exit. It's better to walk in than to be walked in. Deputy Inspector Marcus Pryor was not what she had constructed from his voice on the phone. Voices suggested things: weight, height, age, the particular quality of a person's patience. And her construction had been wrong in almost every particular. He was younger than she expected, mid-30s, with the lean economy of someone who ran and didn't think about it. And he was sitting in a borrowed office in the administrative wing with a laptop and a coffee cup, and the air of a man who had been in borrowed offices long enough that they had all started to feel like home. There was a second person in the room, a woman, early 40s, in civilian clothes that were slightly too well fitted to be random. She was introduced as Special Agent Diane Ferraro, and she had the quality of someone who listened at a professional level, the kind of listening that was also cataloging. Nora sat down across from Pryor without waiting to be asked. It was a small thing, but it mattered. The difference between someone coming in to answer questions and someone coming in to have a conversation. Pryor noticed. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture adjusted slightly. You called me, she said, so you go first. Pryor looked at her for a moment. All right. He opened a folder. Not theatrically. It was just a folder, the next thing he needed. 6 weeks ago, CID opened an investigation into potential misuse of restricted administrative access codes on this base. The specific concern was unauthorized modification of official records, personnel files, evaluation reports, mission documentation. The trail led to Fortwell. More specifically, it led to a pattern of access that originated from the administrative wing and targeted materials connected to a classified operation that ran approximately 7 months ago. Tully's mission, Nora said. Sergeant Marcus Tully, yes. The extraction that failed. He looked at her. What do you know about the operational details? Only what I've been able to piece together from Rex's behavioral history and from what Lena Marsh told me this morning. She kept her answer precise and bounded. I know the mission failed, Tully died, Rex returned alone, and someone subsequently modified the documentation to obscure the circumstances. What did Marsh tell you about the mission itself? That the intelligence that placed Tully's team in that position was compromised. That the failure of the mission would raise questions about how the intelligence was sourced and validated. She paused. She told me that Hollis had buried the documentation to protect an active operation, but that the operation had been closed 8 weeks ago, making the cover-up an artifact of something that no longer needed protecting. Pryor and Ferraro exchanged a look. Brief, controlled, the look of people confirming a shared assessment. That's partially accurate, Pryor said. The operation was closed. The reason Hollis continued the cover-up after the operation closed is where things get more complicated. Tell me. He looked at her steadily. Why did Marsh come to you, specifically you? She said my name came up in relation to the case. Someone who had been watching me work. Nora held his gaze. I don't know who that someone was. I assumed it was a former colleague. Marsh has been building a private case file on the Tully mission for 4 months, Ferraro said. Her voice was low and precise. She's former Defense Intelligence Agency. She left DIA 14 months ago under circumstances that are disputed. Her access to classified materials since then has been officially unauthorized. A pause. The drive she gave you contains legitimate information. The documents on it are real, but Marsh's method of obtaining them is a separate legal question. Nora sat with this. You're telling me the evidence is real, but the chain of custody is compromised. We're telling you that the evidence will require independent verification through official channels before it can be used in any formal proceeding, Pryor said, which is not the same as it being useless. It's a starting point, a roadmap. He closed the folder. We already had most of it. Marsh's drive fills in 3 specific gaps that we'd been working around. He looked at her directly. What Marsh gave you accelerates our timeline by approximately 6 weeks. So you're not here to shut it down? No, he said. We're here because you walked into the middle of an active investigation and did about 4 hours of work that we were going to get to by other means. And we need to understand exactly what you touched and who you spoke to so we can account for it in the evidentiary record. Nora felt something that was not quite relief and not quite vindication, something more tired than either of those, the feeling of a tension releasing that had been present so long she had stopped registering it as tension. What do you need from me? A full account. Everything from your first contact with Marsh, which, based on our monitoring, was the email at 0500 this morning, to the moment you handed the drive to Colonel Webb. He looked at her steadily. And I need you to tell me if there's anything else. Anyone else Marsh mentioned, any other contacts she said she had on base or outside it. Nora thought about the phone call. You always knew what to do with broken things, the voice in the email. She had not told Pryor about the email. He had mentioned it already, which meant they had been monitoring her communications, which was its own category of information to absorb. She mentioned Tully personally, she said she served with him before his last deployment. That's her stated motive for pursuing this. Her stated motive, Ferraro said. It was not a contradiction, it was a note. Is it not accurate? It's one of her motives, Pryor said. She did serve with Tully. That part is verifiable. The rest of her interest in the case is more layered. He checked something on his laptop. We'll get into that. For now, walk me through this morning. Start from 0500. Nora walked him through it. She was methodical and accurate, and she did not editorialize or explain her decisions, because explaining decisions was the habit of someone who thought their decisions needed defending, and she didn't. She described the email, the recording, Carver, Okafor's medical event, the kennel, Webb, Hollis walking into the office. Pryor asked clarifying questions. Ferraro made notes on a tablet with the speed of someone who had done this a great many times. When she finished, Pryor was quiet for a moment. The recording you played for Rex, he said. The one Marsh sent you, where is it now? On my phone. We'll need a copy. You'll need to tell me whether transferring it to you creates a legal complication on my end first, she said, given that I received it from an unauthorized source. Pryor looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not exactly respect, more like upgraded assessment. You're not wrong to ask that, he said. The answer is that your receipt of the recording in good faith, for a demonstrably legitimate purpose, and your subsequent use of it in a way that initiated an official inquiry puts you in a legally protected position. We're not interested in Nora Vasquez. We're interested in the chain of events that led to the modification of an official military record. He paused. But you should know that you're going to be interviewed formally. This is preliminary. I understand. Good. He stood, extended his hand. Don't talk to Marsh if she contacts you again before we do. And don't discuss the content of this conversation with anyone on base except Colonel Webb. She shook his hand. What happens to Hollis? He picked up his folder. That's not a question I can answer yet. Can you tell me what happens to Rex? He paused. That was not a question he had been expecting, and the brief recalibration was visible. The termination order has been suspended pending review, he said. That's the colonel's jurisdiction. As of this morning, Rex is not going anywhere. He looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of someone making an assessment they haven't shared yet. You took a significant personal risk today. You should know that we're aware of that. She said nothing. He left. Ferraro followed. The door closed. Nora sat in the borrowed office alone. She looked at the window. She thought about the email and about the specific phrase that had been in it and about the person who could have known to use that phrase. And she thought about how Pryor had said Marcia's interest was layered and how he had not explained what the layers were. She thought about how 4 months was a long time to build a private case file. About what kind of person, after leaving an intelligence agency under disputed circumstances, spent 4 months tracking a mission failure through restricted documents, and then chose to walk into a military base carrying an encrypted drive full of evidence and hand it to a nurse. Not to Webb directly. Not to CID, who she presumably knew was already investigating. To Nora. The door opened. Carver. He looked out of breath. You need to come to the kennel, he said. What happened? Nothing bad. He was breathing hard, but his face was not the face of bad news. Merriman showed up. The review team sent someone. And Rex... He stopped. Seemed to not quite have the right word. You need to see it. She followed him. The kennel building had more people in it than it had held all morning. Merriman was there, which was mildly ironic given that 2 hours ago he had been preparing to end Rex's life, and was now standing outside the kennel gate making notes on a clipboard with the focused energy of a man converting professional regret into diligence. 2 people from the formal review team, a lieutenant and a specialist with an animal behavior credential, were positioned near the far wall, watching. Carver had placed himself near the entrance with the territorial energy of someone who had decided this was now his responsibility. Rex was standing at the front of the kennel, not pressed against the gate, not in the loaded, coiled posture he took before lunging. He was standing about 3 feet back from the gate, and he was watching the door. And when Nora came through it, he went through a process that was small enough that someone not paying attention would have missed it. A release of tension across his shoulders, a shift of weight, the amber eyes tracking to her with something that had a direction and a target now, rather than the generalized surveillance of an animal that could not predict what the next thing would be. He's been doing that, Carver said quietly, since you left, watching the door. Merriman looked up from his clipboard. He had the expression of a man who had been rearranging his understanding of something all morning and was not yet done. Vasquez, he said, I owe you a conversation. Later, she said. She was already moving toward the kennel. She stopped at the gate. Not reaching through, she wasn't there yet, and Rex wasn't there yet, and rushing the remaining distance was the way to lose the ground already covered. She just stood, close enough that he could read her without effort, far enough that he had the choice. Rex took 1 step toward the gate, then another. He stopped 18 inches from the wire, which was closer than he had allowed anyone to come in 3 weeks, and he stood there with his head at a level slightly below his shoulders. Not submission, not aggression, something in the uncertain middle country between the two, the posture of an animal trying to calibrate something it had not felt in a long time. I know, she said quietly. It's a lot. He made the sound. Low, brief. The same sound from before. It was not a whimper, and it was not a growl, and it was not a bark, and in all her experience with animals in various states of distress, she had not quite heard that specific frequency before from a dog. It sounded like a question, or an argument, or the vocalization of something that had been held in so long that even its expression was uncertain about whether it was allowed to exist. You're allowed, she said. The lieutenant from the review team made a note. Merriman had stopped writing entirely and was just watching. Carver was looking at the wall, which was the posture of a man who needed to be somewhere he wasn't visibly affected. Rex put his nose to the gate. She put her hand up, palm toward him, not reaching through but close. Close enough. He sniffed at the air an inch from her palm, and she felt his breath against her skin, and she did not move. He touched his nose to the wire. The contact lasted 2 seconds. Then he stepped back, turned a half circle, lay down on the kennel floor with his back to the gate, which in the language of a dog that had been hypervigilant for 3 months, was approximately the equivalent of a human exhaling after holding their breath since September. "Well," Merriman said very quietly, to nobody in particular. The formal review meeting happened 2 hours later in a conference room in the main administrative building, and it was everything that the morning had not been. Slow, procedural, full of language that was designed to be accurate rather than human. Webb chaired it. Merriman presented a revised behavioral assessment. The lieutenant from the K-9 evaluation team submitted a preliminary report acknowledging the protocol gaps. A JAG officer participated via secure video link. Nora sat at the end of the table and answered questions when she was asked, and did not offer things when she wasn't. She had learned in other contexts that the procedural aftermath of a crisis had its own ecology, and that inserting the energy of the crisis itself into the procedural aftermath tended to destabilize things that needed to be stable to work. She let the process move at its own pace. She answered accurately. She did not perform. The termination order was formally suspended at 1340. The full behavioral reassessment was scheduled to begin the following Monday. Rex's file was flagged for complete reconstruction pending the CID investigation's outcome. After the meeting, Webb found her in the corridor. He looked tired in the way that people look tired when they had spent a day doing the right thing through significant institutional friction. "I want you to know," he said, "that what happened this morning, the way it happened, is going to require a significant amount of documentation and formal process before anything is resolved. I understand that. I also want you to know that the reason any formal process is happening at all is because you sat in a folding chair in a kennel building." He held her gaze. "That's not nothing, Vasquez." She nodded. He walked away. She stood in the corridor for a moment, then went back to her unit. She worked the rest of her shift. Patience. Procedures. The ordinary machinery of trauma care that had nothing to do with dogs or cover-ups or encrypted drives. She was 3 hours into it when she found something that recalibrated, quietly and completely, every assumption she had been carrying since the stairwell. It came from Tommy Rios, who appeared at her unit door at 16:30 with the expression of someone who had been sitting on information for 2 hours and had finally decided the discomfort of holding it was greater than the discomfort of delivering it. He pulled her into the corridor and lowered his voice to a register that was technically still audible. "I did something this morning," he said, "after you told me about the records hold. Okay? I pulled the original access log for Rex's file before the hold was placed." He looked at the floor, then at her. "The modification to the behavioral reports, the backdating. I found the terminal it came from. CID already knows the terminal location. Yeah, I know, I heard they came in, but there's a second modification, a different one. Earlier, like 2 months earlier." He looked uncomfortable. "It's not Hollis." Nora went still. "What do you mean it's not Hollis?" "The second modification, the earlier one. It came from a different terminal, a different access signature. And it wasn't removing things from the file. It was adding something." He pulled a folded printout from his jacket pocket with the slightly guilty speed of someone who had definitely accessed something above their clearance level and was prepared to face that later. Someone added a field report to Rex's file 2 months ago, a report that wasn't part of the original mission documentation. It was dated retroactively to look like it had always been there. She took the printout, read it. The field report was 2 pages, formatted correctly, dated 7 months ago. It described Rex's behavior during the extraction, not in the clinical language of a K-9 evaluation, but in the specific, first-hand language of someone who had been there. Someone who had watched Marcus Tully go down and had documented what Rex did afterward. The report was unsigned, but the access signature in the log was attached to a personnel record. She looked at the name on Tommy's printout. Lena Marsh. Not unauthorized, classified materials Marsh. Not former DIA, disputed circumstances Marsh. This was a base access signature, which meant a base credential, which meant that Lena Marsh had been on this base before today. Not as a civilian visitor, with a credential, 2 months ago. "She was here," Tommy said, "under a different name. I checked the visitor log." He swallowed. "She signed in as a contractor, spent 4 hours in the records annex." He looked at Nora. "She didn't just find the cover-up and report it. She was inside the base. She had access. She could have taken this to Webb herself, or to CID 2 months ago. He paused. Why didn't she? Nora looked at the printout. She thought about the field report, the first-person specificity of it, the detail that could only come from someone who had been present. She thought about Marsh saying, "I served with Marcus Tully." She thought about a report that described what Rex did when Tully went down, written from the perspective of someone who had watched it happen. She thought about what kind of person spent 4 months building a case, and then, instead of handing it to the authorities who were already investigating, handed it to a nurse and walked away. The kind of person, Nora thought, who needed something to come out in a specific way. Not just that it came out, but how. Through channels that could be controlled. Through a person who could be trusted to move it exactly the right distance and no further. She folded the printout, put it in her pocket. "Don't tell anyone else about this," she said to Tommy. "Not yet." "What are you going to do?" She thought about Pryor. About the instruction not to contact Marsh, about the formal process now underway, the JAG office, the CID investigation, the procedural machinery that was, as of this afternoon, pointed in the right direction. She thought about the drive Marsh had handed her. The drive that had 3 specific gaps in CID's existing evidence, filled neatly. The drive that had accelerated CID's timeline by 6 weeks. The drive that Marsh had walked in here today to deliver, personally, into Nora's hands, after being on this base 2 months ago when she could have done something far more direct. 6 weeks. The CID investigation would have reached the same conclusion in 6 weeks, but 6 weeks was 72 hours multiplied by 14. Rex would have been dead for 3 months before CID finished what it was already doing. Marsh had not come here to expose Hollis. CID was already doing that. Marsh had come here because Rex was going to die on Friday, and the official process was not going to move fast enough to stop it, and she needed someone who would move differently. Not outside the system, just faster than the system, in the specific gap between what the system could do and when it could do it. And she had chosen Nora for that, specifically, deliberately, which meant she had known about Rex's timeline, which meant she had been watching not just the investigation, but the kennel, which meant the 4 months of case building, the drive, the email, the phone call, the walk into the kennel building. All of it was one operation, and Nora had been a component in it, not a recruit. She had been placed. "Vasquez," Tommy said. She looked up. "I need to make a phone call," she said. "Go back to your office. Don't log anything else today." He went. She pulled out her phone. She did not call Pryor. She stood in the corridor of the East Wing, under fluorescent lights, in scrubs that had been on her body for 11 hours. And she scrolled to the unknown number that had called her in the stairwell. The number Marsh had used. The number that was probably already dead and forwarded to nothing. She pressed call. It rang twice. Marsh picked up. "I know you were here 2 months ago," Nora said. "I know about the field report you added to the file. I know this wasn't about exposing the cover-up. CID was already doing that." She kept her voice even. "I want to know what you were actually protecting, and I want to know why Rex." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that Nora could hear ambient sound, outdoor air, traffic, something mechanical at a distance. Marsh was outside, moving. "Because the field report I added to his file is not the only thing I put in that system 2 months ago," Marsh said. Her voice was different than it had been in the kennel building. Not the operational evenness. Something underneath it, older. "There's a second document. I embedded it in the mission archive under a file name that looks like a formatting artifact. It won't surface in a standard records pull, only in a full forensic audit." She paused. CID's audit is scheduled to run on Monday. When it runs, that document comes out. "What's in it?" Another pause. "The name of the intelligence source," Marsh said. "The one who compromised Tully's mission. The one Hollis claimed was still active to justify the cover-up." Her voice was flat now. Flat and careful, and covering something that had a different texture underneath. The source wasn't a foreign asset. It wasn't an infiltration. It was a person inside the operation, someone who passed positioning information to the wrong people. She stopped. Nora waited. "The source is still on this base," Marsh said, "and they have no idea the document exists." Nora stood in the corridor for 3 seconds after the call ended, long enough to let the information settle into something she could act on rather than just react to. A source still on the base, a document embedded in the mission archive, invisible to standard pulls set to surface in Monday's forensic audit. 2 days away. 48 hours during which a person who had compromised a special operations extraction, who had sent Marcus Tully's team into a position they couldn't survive, was walking around Fortwell without knowing their name was sitting in a hidden file, waiting. She called Pryor. He picked up on the second ring. She told him what Marsh had said, in the same methodical way she had given him the morning's account. Precise, bounded, no editorializing. When she finished, there was a silence on his end that had a specific quality, the silence of someone processing information that had just changed the shape of their day in ways they were rapidly calculating. "Where are you right now?" he said. "East Wing Corridor. Don't move, I'm coming to you." He was there in 4 minutes, which told her that he had been closer than the administrative wing. Ferraro was with him. They moved her into an empty exam room and closed the door, and Pryor leaned against the wall with his arms folded and the expression of a man who was running multiple threads simultaneously and doing it well but not without effort. "The embedded document," he said. "She told you it would surface in the Monday audit." "Yes." "Which means she has detailed knowledge of our forensic protocol timeline." "Yes," Nora said again. "She knew your audit schedule. She knew the exact file structure that would hide a document from a standard pull. She was on this base 2 months ago with a credential, and she added a field report to Rex's file that only she could have written. First-hand, present-tense detail from the extraction site." She looked at him steadily. "She was there, at the mission." Ferraro looked at Pryor. He looked at the floor for a moment, and she could see him deciding how much to give back, running the calculation between operational security and the practical reality that Nora had now twice done things that moved his investigation forward in ways he hadn't planned. "Lena Marsh was an intelligence officer attached to special operations," he said finally. "She was present during mission planning for the Tully extraction. Not on the ground, in the forward command element." He paused. "When the mission failed and the debrief happened, Marsh's conduct during the planning phase was reviewed as part of standard procedure. She was cleared. She left DIA 3 months later." He looked at Nora. "She told us she left voluntarily, that she couldn't continue working in an environment where a mission failure of that magnitude was going to be documented the way it was documented." "But you don't believe that's the whole reason." "We believe it's true," he said carefully. "We also believe it's not complete." He looked at her directly. "Marsh knew who the source was before she built her case file. She's known for months. She could have given us the name at any point and let the investigation handle it. But she didn't." "No." "Because she wanted it to come out through the audit," Nora said slowly, working it as she said it. "Through an official forensic process. A process that can't be challenged or attributed to a source with disputed credibility. She needed the name to surface through the system, not through her, because anything coming from her can be complicated by her history with DIA. She was protecting the integrity of the eventual prosecution," Ferraro said. "Yes, at the cost of 4 months and very nearly 1 Belgian Malinois." "She knew about Rex's timeline?" Nora asked. "She'd been monitoring the K9 unit's communications," Pryor said. "She knew the evaluation was coming, knew the timeline, knew that the standard process wasn't going to move fast enough." He looked at her with something that was almost uncomfortable in its directness. "She needed someone who would move at a different speed, who had medical access, who had the specific background to read Rex's behavior accurately, who wouldn't need to be convinced that what everyone was calling violence was actually trauma." He paused. "She researched you for 3 weeks before she sent that email." Nora absorbed this. All of it. The months of construction, the careful placement, the drive that was not revelatory but confirmatory, filling the specific gaps that CID already needed filled. Being chosen for a role in something that had been running without her knowledge for 4 months. She thought about how she should feel about that and found that the answer was complicated. Not entirely comfortable, not betrayed exactly, something in between that didn't have a clean name. "The source on the base," she said. "You know who it is." Pryor nodded once. "The audit is Monday, 2 days." "Yes." "And they're here, right now, today." "Yes." She looked at him. "What do you need me to do?" He almost smiled. It was a brief thing, more in the eyes than the mouth, and it was gone quickly. "Nothing," he said. "For the first time since 0500, Vasquez, I need you to do nothing. Go back to your unit, finish your shift, go to sleep, let the process run." He pushed off the wall. You've done enough for one day. She wanted to argue. The wanting was a reflex, and she recognized it as a reflex, and she let it pass. He was right. The machine was running, the document was in the file. Monday was 47 hours away. She was a trauma nurse on a 12-week rotation, and she had walked into 6 different rooms today that she had no official standing to be in, and every one of them had been necessary, and none of the remaining ones were. Tell me when the audit runs, she said. I'll be in touch. They left. She stood in the exam room alone for a moment, then went back to her unit and worked the rest of her shift, and did not do anything else. The weekend was long in the specific way that weekends were long when you knew something was coming on Monday, and there was nothing to do but wait. She visited Rex on Saturday morning and again on Sunday afternoon, and each time the distance between them was slightly smaller. Not because she was pushing it, but because he was choosing it, making the decision in the incremental way that animals made decisions when they were genuinely deciding rather than being managed toward an outcome. On Saturday, he came to the front of the kennel when she sat in the folding chair. On Sunday, she put her hand through the gate, and he sniffed the length of her arm from wrist to elbow with the methodical intensity of an animal filing information. And then he lay down with his side against the gate, and she felt the heat of him through the wire, and she sat there for 40 minutes reading nothing, thinking about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of necessary. Carver came by on Sunday and stood at the kennel door and watched for a while. Merriman wants to do a full behavioral baseline on Monday, he said. Official stuff, for the reassessment. I know, I'll be there. He was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something? Sure. The scar. He hesitated. On your jaw. I've been trying not to ask. She looked at him. He had the decency to look slightly embarrassed about asking, which was why she answered. Shrapnel, she said. A long time ago. A place I'm not going to tell you about. He nodded. He didn't push. It was one of the things she had come to appreciate about Carver. He knew the shape of a closed door. Thank you, he said, for whatever the right word is. For today. For all of it. You did the stairwell, she said. That was nothing. That was not nothing. He looked at Rex, pressed against the gate with his eyes half closed in the particular way of a dog that was not asleep, but was somewhere close to rest. He looks different, Carver said. He is different, she said. So are we. Everything that happens to us changes us. The question is just what direction. The forensic audit ran at 0600 on Monday. She knew this because Pryor had sent a brief text the night before. Audit scheduled 0600. Stand by. Which was more than he'd promised and less than she wanted, which was probably about right. She was in the kennel building at 0700 for Merriman's behavioral baseline when her phone buzzed. Pryor. She stepped outside. The document surfaced, he said. We have the name. She leaned against the outside wall of the kennel building and looked at the gray Monday sky. Who? A pause. That's going to become public today. I wanted to tell you before it did. He said the name. She stood very still. The name was not Hollis. She had known it wasn't Hollis. Hollis had buried things to manage a mess she hadn't created, the cover-up artist rather than the source. The name Pryor said was someone she had seen in passing twice in the past week and registered as peripheral, a personnel officer in the administrative wing, mid-rank, unremarkable in the way that people were unremarkable when they had spent years being carefully unremarkable. The name belonged to someone who had been on Fortwell for 3 years, long enough to build relationships, long enough to understand which information moved where and how to get it to the people who would pay for it. How long have they known, she said, meaning the CID investigation. The connection between the personnel office and the compromised intelligence has been in our file for 4 weeks, Pryor said. But the document Marsh embedded gives us the specific communication chain. It's direct. It's prosecutable. He paused. We're executing the arrest this morning. She nodded, which was a useless gesture on a phone call, and then said, okay, because that was the only thing that fit the moment. The rest of the process takes time, he said. Court-martial is months away. The Hollis situation is a separate administrative proceeding. It's going to be slow. I know. Vasquez. A pause. Not the operational pause of someone calculating, something more personal. The field report Marsh added to Rex's file. The first-hand account of the extraction. I want you to know what it says. what Rex actually did that day. He seemed to consider the phrasing for a moment. Tully went down in an exposed position. The team couldn't reach him immediately. Too much incoming fire. Rex went back. Twice. He wasn't attacking his subsequent handlers out of damage or instability. The aggression triggers, loud commands, sudden arm movements. They were the same movements the hostile contacts made in the field. Rex spent 3 months reacting to people who moved like the people who killed his handler. He stopped. He was still trying to protect him. 3 months later, in a kennel in Virginia. Nora put her free hand flat against the cold exterior wall of the kennel building. She felt the concrete against her palm. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Go back inside," Pryor said. "Your dog is waiting." She went back inside. The arrest happened at 10:20 in the administrative wing, and by 10:45 it was the only thing anyone on the base was talking about. Nora heard about it in fragments, from Carver, from Tommy Rios, who appeared at the kennel door vibrating with the particular energy of someone sitting on information they were absolutely going to share regardless of any instruction to the contrary, from the general shift in ambient noise that happened on any base when something significant moved through its institutional body. She let it reach her in fragments. She did not go to watch. She stayed in the kennel building and helped Merriman run the behavioral baseline, which required patience and stillness and the capacity to let Rex move at his own pace through a series of controlled stimuli while Merriman documented responses with the careful attention of a man doing penance through diligence. Rex did not lunge at any of the stimuli. He was watchful and occasionally stiff, and twice he stopped responding and pressed himself against Nora's leg with a weight and deliberateness that was not fear so much as preference. This, rather than that, you, rather than the unfamiliar thing. And she stood steady and let him, and Merriman noted it without comment, and the baseline was completed by noon. "He's manageable," Merriman said afterward. He said it to his clipboard, not to Nora, but it was meant for both. The reactivity is real. The triggers are specific and they're addressable. Given a structured protocol and consistent handler contact, he's a viable rehabilitation candidate. He looked up. "This is not the same animal the evaluation board assessed." "He is exactly the same animal," Nora said. "The assessment was wrong." Merriman looked at her for a moment. He had the expression of a man absorbing a correction that was accurate and that he was going to have to sit with. "Yes," he said. "It was." The formal investigation findings were released internally on Wednesday. Nora read the summary that Webb sent to all department heads with the particular attention of someone checking work they had already done by feel. It was accurate. It was thorough in ways that went past what she had been able to establish on Friday morning, reaching into the institutional record with the forensic authority of a proper investigation and surfacing things she had only gestured toward. The communication chain between Hollis and the evaluation board coordinator, the specific access log entries. The timeline of document modification mapped against the timeline of Hollis's administrative movements. The connection between the personnel officer's communication with external parties and the intelligence failure that had sent Tully's team into the wrong position. All of it laid out, all of it real. The kind of real that had legal weight and institutional consequence and could not be dismissed because a nurse on rotation had gone looking for it. Hollis was relieved of command on Thursday and placed under formal administrative restriction pending the military justice process. The announcement was made through official channels, in the clinical language of those channels, without editorial. But the base was small, and the base knew what it meant, and by Thursday afternoon the thing that had been invisible for 3 months, the specific weight of a wrong thing being allowed to continue, had shifted into something that had a different texture entirely. Nora walked through the base on Thursday evening, and it felt different, not resolved. Resolution was months away, maybe longer, but different. The way a room felt different when a window was finally opened. 2 weeks after the arrest, Rex was moved from the kennel to a transitional housing unit closer to the medical complex. It was not a dramatic change. He was still in a controlled environment, still in an assessment phase, still requiring the careful, non-negotiable slow work of rebuilding trust with a world that had given him significant evidence against trusting it. But the kennel building, with its fluorescent hum and its concrete smell and its history of being the place where everyone waited to see how badly things would go, that was behind him. Nora's rotation was 12 weeks. She had been on base for 8. She was not thinking about the 4 weeks remaining in the way she had been thinking about them before Friday. Before, they had been a countdown towards something neutral. The end of the rotation, the return to Raleigh, the resumption of civilian trauma work in a hospital where she knew everyone and everyone knew her, and the days were hard but comprehensible. Now the 4 weeks had a different shape, and she was not entirely sure yet what that shape meant or what she was going to do about it. She was thinking about this on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the transitional unit with Rex's head on her thigh. He had started doing this 2 days ago, the head-on-thigh thing, with the absolute commitment of a dog who had decided that this was now a reasonable thing to do and was not interested in being argued with about it, when Pryor appeared at the door. He looked like someone who had slept recently and eaten something, which was an improvement on the versions of him she had seen in the borrowed offices. He knocked on the open door frame. Rex's ears went up. His body tensed. Nora put her hand on his shoulder, just rested it there. No command, no pressure. And he relaxed by degrees, watching Pryor with attention rather than reaction. "He knows you," Pryor said, looking at the dog. "He's learning the difference between threat and unfamiliar," she said. "It's slow work." Pryor came in and sat on the bench across from her. He had a folder, not the operational folder of the first meeting, something thinner. "Marsh has been located," he said. "She's cooperating with the formal investigation. Her role in the case is complicated, legally, but the intelligence she gathered and the method she used to surface it is being assessed by people above my pay grade." He paused. "She asked me to give you something." He held out an envelope. She took it. Inside was a single photograph, printed on regular paper, slightly pixelated from being enlarged past its original resolution. A man in the field, in the specific nowhere and everywhere landscape of a forward operating position, crouched beside a Belgian Malinois puppy with the large ears and ungainly proportions of a very young animal. The man was laughing at something outside the frame. The puppy was looking directly at the camera with the ancient, slightly bewildered seriousness of young dogs who had not yet decided what the world was. On the back, in handwriting that was not Marsh's, his name was always Rex. He just needed someone to remember that. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Rex shifted his head on her thigh, adjusting his position without fully waking from the half-doze he had settled into. He was heavy. He was warm. He made the specific low sound that she had come to understand, in 8 weeks, was not a question or an argument, but a declaration. "I am here. This is where I am." And she felt it in her sternum as much as she heard it. "Marsh wrote the field report herself," Nora said. "She was there. She watched Tully go down." "Yes." "And she spent 4 months making sure the name that caused it would surface in a way that couldn't be challenged." She looked at the photograph. "She didn't do that for the investigation. She did it for him." Pryor was quiet for a moment. "We do strange things," he said, "when we can't do the obvious one." She set the photograph on her knee, beside Rex's head, and looked at both of them, the dog and the young man in the picture, the one who had laughed at something out of frame and was not here anymore, and the one who was. "What happens to Rex?" she said. "Officially, after the reassessment." "Webb is recommending him for the rehabilitation program," Pryor said. "There's a pilot program for canine animals with handler trauma. They work alongside combat stress teams in the medical complex. It's new. It's not fully funded, but Webb is backing it." He paused. "The program needs a coordinator, someone with trauma experience who can also manage the human-animal interaction protocols." She looked at him. "It's not a nursing role," he said. "It's a different kind of work. Longer hours, less structured, no guaranteed outcome on any given day." He set the thin folder on the bench beside him. 12-week rotation becomes a permanent posting if the person wants it. Webb asked me to mention it." Rex's ear twitched. He did not open his eyes. She looked at the photograph in her hand, the man who had laughed, the puppy who had grown into a dog who had carried something unbearable across an ocean and been punished for it. All the versions of a story that looked like one thing from a distance and another thing entirely when you got close enough to sit on the floor of a kennel and just stay. The thing she had learned in the work she had done for the previous 10 years and the specific 8 weeks before that was that the moments that changed things were rarely the dramatic ones. They were the folding chair moments, the staying when you could leave moments, the hand on the wire moments, The moments when the obvious move was to go and you chose instead to remain, without knowing what remaining would mean, because something in the room needed a person to make that choice. You could not plan for those moments. You could only be the kind of person who made them when they arrived. She had spent 7 years in a hospital in Raleigh, being excellent at a job that needed doing. She had been necessary there, in the functional way of skilled people in understaffed institutions. Nobody at Raleigh had been waiting for her specifically. The work would have continued without her, competently, ably, by other hands. She looked at Rex. He opened one eye. Amber, direct, with the quality of attention she had first seen in the kennel. Not the surveillance of a threatened animal, but something that had a destination, a specific, chosen destination. "Tell Webb yes," she said. Pryor nodded once, picked up his folder, and left without ceremony, which she appreciated about him. The formal recognition happened on a Thursday morning 6 weeks later, in the small conference room of the main administrative building, because Webb was not a ceremony man and had organized something appropriately sized. 12 people. Merriman, Carver, Pryor, Ferraro. Tommy Rios in the back row looking like he had ironed his uniform for the first time in recent memory. The JAG officer via video link. 2 members of Tully's former unit, flown in at Webb's personal request, who stood at the back of the room with the particular quiet of people who were not sure yet what they were allowed to feel about the day. Rex was there. On a lead, which was new. He had not been on a lead for months, had not tolerated a lead, and he wore it now with the resigned dignity of a dog who had decided that tolerating a lead was a reasonable price for being in a room with Nora. He sat beside her chair. He was not perfectly still. He shifted. He looked at people with the measuring attention that was simply who he was. He pressed against her calf twice when someone moved too suddenly near the front. He was not a finished thing. He was a working thing, which was different and better. Webb spoke briefly and without flourish, which was the right register. He said that the investigation had concluded, that the individuals responsible for the modification of official records and the suppression of mission documentation had been referred for court-martial proceedings, and that the canine behavioral evaluation had been formally withdrawn and replaced with a new assessment accurately reflecting the animal's history and therapeutic potential. He said that none of it would have happened when it did without a nurse who had been on the base for 6 days when she decided that the correct response to an animal in a kennel was to pull up a chair. He did not say anything that was untrue. He also did not say everything that was true, because the complete truth was layered in the way that Pryor had said Marsh's motives were layered, and some of those layers were still working their way through systems that moved slowly and carefully and for good reason. But the part that could be said publicly was said, and it was said accurately, and the 2 soldiers from Tully's unit at the back of the room stood a little differently when it was over than they had been standing at the beginning. Carver shook her hand afterward and then, somewhat to both of their surprise, pulled her into a brief hug that lasted exactly as long as necessary and no longer, and stepped back looking at the wall. "You came in on a Tuesday," he said. 6 days. 7 by then, she said. "You always correct that." "It's accurate." He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere unexpected, and it surprised them both and made the room briefly lighter. Rex looked up at the sound and his tail moved once. Not the full sweep of an uncomplicated dog, but something, a beginning, the motion of something that was remembering it knew how to do this. Merriman shook her hand formally and told her that the behavioral baseline data from the first assessment would be written up for peer review, that the protocol gaps in military canine trauma evaluation needed to be addressed at a systemic level, and he intended to be part of that. She believed him. He had spent 6 weeks being part of it already, turning professional regret into something useful, which was the best version of how people responded to having gotten something badly wrong. Tommy Rios appeared at her elbow as people were beginning to disperse. He had, in fact, ironed his uniform, and he looked very young in it. "You said that first day in the break room that you were probably not going to do something weird." I said probably. "Yeah." He grinned. "You said probably." He looked at Rex, who was tolerating his proximity with the measured goodwill of a dog who had decided that most people were not threats, which was not the same as being comfortable with them, but was a start. "Is it true you're staying?" "Starting next week." "Doing what?" "Something that doesn't have a good job title yet," she said. "Webb is working on it." Tommy nodded. He looked at Rex again. "Does he know? That he's staying?" She looked at the dog. Rex looked up at her in that way of his, direct, measuring, with the particular quality of attention she had first seen in the kennel and had not seen diminish in 10 weeks, a quality that was not dependence but was choice, the repeated daily choice of an animal that had decided where it wanted to direct its regard and was directing it. "He knows," she said. The room emptied slowly. Pryor left with a nod that carried more weight than most people's speeches. Ferraro gave her a card with a number that meant something, and said very little. The soldiers from Tully's unit came to her last, and the older one, a staff sergeant with a face that had been through more weather than his age suggested, crouched down to Rex's level and held out the back of his hand, and Rex sniffed it with the slow deliberateness of something that mattered. And the staff sergeant pressed his lips together and stood back up and said quietly, to no one in particular, "He's okay." "He's going to be," Nora said. "No." The staff sergeant shook his head. He was looking at Rex with the look of someone who had been worrying about something for a long time and had just set it down. "He's okay. Right now. He's okay right now." He looked at her. "That's enough." She thought about that on the walk back to the transitional unit, Rex's lead in her hand, the October sun lower now than when she had arrived at Fortwell 8 weeks ago, the air carrying the first real edge of coming cold. She thought about the things that did not get said in recognition ceremonies, the things that happened in stairwells and folding chairs and phone calls at 0500, the things that did not have the shape of heroism but had its function, the staying, the reading, the refusal to accept someone else's assessment of what a thing was worth. She thought about Marcus Tully, who she had never met, whose laugh existed in one photograph and whose voice existed in a 30-second recording, and whose dog was walking beside her through the November-edged air of a Virginia military base, alive, because someone had sat in a chair and paid attention. She thought about all the things that were broken in the world that were not actually broken, that were hurt and frightened and waiting for someone to come close enough to read what they were actually saying rather than what they appeared to be saying from a safe distance. She thought about the distance, and about what it cost to close it, and about the fact that the cost was real, and the outcome was not guaranteed, and she would do it again, the next time, without hesitation. Not because she was fearless. She was not fearless. Her hands had shaken in Webb's office, and her legs had gone unsteady in the corridor, and she had spent most of Friday afternoon running on the specific borrowed fuel of necessity, which burned clean but burned fast. But fear was information, not instruction. It told you where the threshold was. It didn't tell you whether to cross it. Rex stopped walking. She stopped with him. He was looking at something, a sparrow on the ground 20 feet ahead, perfectly still, in the way that small birds went still when something larger was paying attention. They stood and watched it. The sparrow looked back. Then, in the way of sparrows, it simply left, without drama, into the air. Rex looked up at Nora. She looked back at him. "Yeah," she said. "I know." She did not know exactly what she was responding to. That was all right. The knowing would come in the slow way that it came, in the hours and weeks of ordinary work ahead, in the mornings in the transitional unit, and the afternoons with the combat stress teams, and the days that would be hard and specific and not cinematic in any way. The days that were about showing up rather than breaking through, which were the days that actually built things that lasted. She started walking again. He walked beside her, matching her pace with the easy proprioception of a dog that had decided this was his direction now. This was his person. This is where I go. The base moved around them, ordinary and ongoing, full of people carrying things they hadn't been given the language to set down. Maybe some of them would find someone who would sit in a chair and stay. Maybe some of them wouldn't. That was the unbearable truth of the work, that you could not help everyone, could not reach every locked kennel, could not be everywhere that something needed someone to come close and read it right. But you could be here. You could be this. You could walk through a door that everyone else had decided was not your door to walk through, and you could sit down, and you could stay until something that had stopped believing in the possibility of being understood began, slowly, imperfectly, with every reason not to believe again. That was not nothing. That was in fact everything.